I'm Hannah Weaver. I'm a current fellow at the Institute for Ideas and Imagination and assistant professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University in New York.
Hi, I'm Emma Claussen. I am a specialist of 16th and 17th century literature at Trinity College in Cambridge, UK.
I guess I should have mentioned I'm a medievalist.
Oh, yeah.
This is important because we're here today not to talk about 16th and 17th century literature, nor the Middle Ages, but instead one of the greats of turn-of-the-century French literature, Proust.
That's right. And that's one of the difficult, but I think rewarding things about doing it is that we're not actually specialists of that period. So why are we working together on a project on Proust?
Together, we're making a podcast about the experience of reading Proust as non-experts, as people that have trained really a lot in studying literature and how to read, but really are not experts in early 20th century literature, nor the 19th century, nor any neighboring period. Our podcast is called Proust Curious, and it'll be available in fall 2024, wherever you get your podcasts. Why are we doing it?
Well, we had a conversation also in Paris a few months ago about both of our shared desire to read this, but I think in a larger sense it puts some pressure on how we work within our discipline and our sense of expertise, and I think that's challenging but productive also, because I think within French studies or literary studies, the difference between studying intensively like one century, say the 17th century, and reading Proust is not that significant to an outsider, but it does feel very very large to a specialist. So I think that puts in tension some of the questions that we experience working in and outside our own fields.
It's such a relief, really, to get out of your lane. It's something that we both have the chance to do in teaching. I know that I teach a course at Columbia called Literature Humanities, or LitHum. That is a survey course that goes from Homer until very recent poetry. The most recent author we teach is Claudia Rankine. And I find the course so rewarding to teach because it's really fun to bring the apparatus of skills that I have developed over all these years of literary study to bear on things that I really am by no means an expert in. It's really fun to read the Iliad every year. And I know you also teach a class that is more trans-temporal.
Yeah, it's all in French studies. So our earliest text is the Les de Marie de France, but the most recent is a 21st century novel, kind of auto-fictional novel called Autoportrait en vert, Self-Portrait in Green by Marianne Diay. So it's such a range, includes theatre, film. It's been really fun. It's quite stimulating to look at such a range. It's our first year survey course in French at Cambridge.
Yeah, and Literature Humanities is also for first years.
Yeah.
Was there one text that was most fun to teach in that course?
Well, actually, so sorry to 19th centuryists, but one that surprised me that I absolutely loved was Le Père Goriot by Balzac, because it just has so much pace and energy and humour that I was not expecting. And maybe that gave me a taste for a long novel, or a long sequence of novels. I don't know if you have a forthcoming or a future podcast on La Comédie Humaine.
No, there's an ambitious podcast, La Comédie Humaine.
I think
oh
not.
Goodness, no. I think one mega novel is the right size for a podcast.
I agree. But outside of teaching as well, I think thinking across centuries and thinking kind of comparatively in different time periods is something that I am trying to also do in my research, which is partly how we met.
That's right, yeah.
Because I was in Columbia doing a project on Edward Said, who's a 21st century critic. So this is one of the things that I find really exciting and difficult about both teaching and research, is thinking kind of not necessarily trans-temporally, but across different different time periods, which isn't to say that I'm intending to do any actual research writing on Proust.
No, I think neither of us does.
But I think that also explains part of the appeal, because it's also a text that works with, I mean, obviously famously it's about time. Insightful there. But it also works with lots of different senses of what time is, which is something we might talk a little bit about more today.
Right. What's it been like so far for you reading Proust, Emma?
It's been, how do I say this? Surprisingly pleasurable.
No, I think that's worth bringing up, because I think people do think it's sort of a dour and monumental task. So surprisingly pleasurable. How so?
Well, I don't want to pretend that it's easy, but once you get immersed in the narration, it is so engrossing and funny and charming, and it also evokes a whole world. So I think we've talked about this. We've both been reading shorter contemporary novels that just didn't create that sense of a world or give you the same amount of time to spend with characters, and certainly not their protagonists. And I think there's something so satisfying about this experience for that reason. So although sometimes when as we've also talked about this, when I've left it for a few days or I've got a lot of other work to do, it can feel quite constraining to have this monumental reading project at the same time.
Sorry.
It's also just feels like a window outside of my real life, which again is quite meta, because windows are going to come up too, but that's also part of how the narrator experiences like literature and art. What about for you? How's it been?
Yeah, I think that's right. It feels like a tunnel into a different place, and a place where the small is given every bit as much attention as the large. In fact, perhaps more attention. Proust is famously interested in things like a moist odor that comes out of a bathroom rather than in questions like, what is life? And so he sort of finds the profound in the everyday in a way that I think is both incredibly immersive while you're reading it, but then also draws that out in your daily life as well. Yeah. So it's really a book that that permeates your being in a way. And part of the reason that we took this on or started to talk about it in the first place is I recently read Laure Murat's Proust, Roman familial, which was the winner of the Prix Medici this year, or I guess in 2023 technically, which was wonderful. And there are a couple of things that she does or says in this book that I think were really generative for me. One of them is that she uses Proust as a way to understand her reality, her very particular reality as a descendant from two sorts of nobility, and the sort of, frankly, from my perspective as sort of a middle-class American, bizarre upbringing that engendered, and then the ways that it's affected her later life. So Proust helped her find a way in to all of those dynamics. So it really was a roman familial for her. But she also, first of all, says Proust isn't that hard. In a sense, I think we do agree with her in that once you're in it, you're in it. But in another way, I do think, especially if you're if French is an acquired language, there are challenges remain. And finally, she said, it's only 7 livres de poche, which is true. And it did make me feel, I absolutely read more than 7 books in a year. There's no reason I can't be reading Proust. I shared this with Emma, and we decided to make Proust Curious together.
Yeah, and I think it is really fun.
It's so fun.
It's been pleasurable. And that's also something that I'm trying to get across in my teaching and in I guess, my development as an academic. No, is the question of pleasure, like, quite seriously, because that doesn't always receive its place.
No, and it's not only is it fun, it's so funny. Yeah, I truly will be giggling while I'm reading some of his descriptions of people. And again, I think it has a sort of dour reputation. It's sort of like we rattle off, reading Proust is this thing. Reading War and Peace, another book that is wonderful.
And a lot of things get described as Proustian, don't they?
Oh, yes. But
Proustian
it's because they're evocative, I guess. So Proustian has become a synonym of evocative, which is really sort of a horrible reduction.
Yeah. Yeah, that totally dilutes it because, as this is a spoiler for the podcast, but as we also talk about it on there, it's actually a very weird book.
Yeah, it is.
And another thing that we talk about that tracks through is how charming actually the narrator is, and the voice that you're living with, even though that voice is it modulates and changes and
is difficult to pin down. Yeah. But it is somehow
there's a
charming.
Warmth.
Yeah, there's a warmth.
Yeah.
So I think today we're going to talk about some of the things we've brought up, that some of Proust's humor, some of the warmth of the narrator, some of the sense of time and world that Proust builds, all the while making connections to our fields of expertise, because at the end of the day, we couldn't quite resist. We couldn't resist being at least somewhat expert on what we're talking about, even if tangentially so. So I'm hoping that some of the things that we're going to discuss in more depth will bring some of our overarching comments to life.
Yeah, so we've been talking about what's it like to read Proust as pre-modernists, and I think for the rest of this conversation, we're going to talk about the pre-modern, or aspects of the pre-modern in Proust, with the caveat that we're only on volume 2.
That's right. So this is a work in progress. A glimpse into a work in progress. We should have said that right at the beginning. That's okay. We can say it now.
So the reason that we wanted to talk about Proust and the pre-modern is not only because we are, as we've said many times, pre-modernists reading Proust.
That's the alt title for our podcast.
But because really early in the reading process, because early in volume 1, there's this scene. So the narrator spends most of the first 50 or so pages lying in bed, having a difficult time in various ways. And one of the things that his family gives him to console him is this kind of projector.
It's called a magic lantern, but it's a species of projector that was popular in the late 19th century. Yeah.
And what it projects, or what he projects, is a kind of medieval or medievalizing scene, or so we think. So as soon as I read this, I wanted to ask Anna about it. And that made me track slightly variably as I was reading those kinds of instances. So shall we have a look at that, the magic lantern scene?
Yes, I will read a bit of this magic lantern passage, and today we're using the revised Moncrief translation for our excerpts. Someone had indeed had the happy idea of giving me, to distract me on evenings when I seemed abnormally wretched, a magic lantern, which used to be set on top of my lamp while we waited for dinner time to come. And after the fashion of the master builders and glass painters of Gothic days, it substituted for the opaqueness of my walls an impalpable iridescence, supernatural phenomena of many colors, in which legends were depicted as on a shifting and transitory window. He goes on. And indeed, I found plenty of charm in these bright projections of the story of Geneviève de Brabant, which seemed to emanate from a Merovingian past and shed around me the reflections of such ancient history. But I cannot express the discomfort I felt at this intrusion of mystery and beauty into a room which I had succeeded in filling with my own personality in friendships with his moi, until I thought no more of it than of myself.
It's incredible.
It is incredible.
So what's so striking is that use of projection. I'm sure this is much storied, but the use of such a modern technology to project a sense of this past that's so ancient, that's also not very, I think it's quite signaled that it's not any kind of historical past, because it's so ancient. Could be Merovingian. So
could be Gothic. Those are wildly different periods of time. Those are some 600 years apart. And
the sort of the stories that are on the wall, and the colours, and they're like a stained glass window, but also supernatural. Mm-hmm. So there's all these layers. And
indeed, the light is layered on top of his room, and the light replaces himself in a way. He finds it disturbing that it evicts his personality or his selfhood, his moi, in favor of these, what in a different part of the passage he calls astral bodies of Geneviève and her abuser, a man called Golo.
So who is Geneviève de Brabant?
Geneviève de Brabant, despite the fact that clearly Proust feels this is a medieval character, and certainly the story is meant to take place sort of long ago and far away, once upon a time, which signals a sort of at least faux Middle Ages. Geneviève de Brabant, the story is first recorded at the very end of the 15th century in Latin, and the first French version was written in 1647. In this story, Geneviève, a faithful and devoted wife of a soldier in Charles Martel's army, finds herself pregnant on the same day that her husband leaves for a campaign with Charles Martel. And Golo, the steward who's left in his place, attempts to seduce his master's wife. She resists him as a faithful woman. He attempts to brand her child as the product of adultery, and indeed sends a letter to her husband in that effect. Her husband sends back that she and the child should be executed, but as is typical in this sort of story, a faithful servant instead leaves them in the woods, where she's nourished by the milk of a doe and survives, and ultimately proves herself the faithful wife that she is. Golo is punished. She's back with her husband. Everything turns out well. But this is a sort of, like in the long ago times, the faithful woman ultimately was proven to be so after some help from her animal friends.
It's great that it's already a fake medieval story.
It's already a fake medieval story, and then we have
century.
this fake stained glass, which is actually just light projected on a wall, which is really just magnificently different from a window, in fact. But the suggestion that a wall might be as permeable as a window, or as filled with story as stained glass, is really really something.
She comes back as well, doesn't she, Geneviève de Brabant? Mm-hmm. So again, in a kind of projection move, the narrator's projecting her onto the Duchess of Guermantes. Mm-hmm, and then is really devastated when she doesn't live up to his projection. And that is absolutely a theme of his relationship to
everything.
Yeah. So where is that sentence going? To the pre-modern, to the past, to everything.
Yeah, disappointment. Disappointment. And really, it is disappointment, but the French word déception, the false friend deception, is also part of his disappointment. Like, he's disappointed because he's sort of deceived himself into thinking that things will potentially be different.
So the past is another one of his fantasies, like the deep past, the kind of this so ancient past.
Right. So ancient, and yet
so old.
Yeah, so old. It's just so old, the past. And yet, nevertheless, one of the things that's really striking as a reading experience, especially for me, again, I'm an American, born in the 20th century, not to brag or anything, but my point is that the level of referentiality as you're reading is very striking, and not only does it enrich the world and make it feel more like a complete world, but it also brings into play this sort of layering that we're already seeing with the evocation of Geneviève de Brabant as a 19th century magic lantern in a room in a small town in France with this story that's already a fake to some extent. This sort of bringing a like superposition of art or artifice onto lived reality, or vice versa, is a real obsession for Proust. And one of the medievalizing, I'm not sure, the medieval moments, we could say, in Proust that caught my attention was his creation of a portal on a church on one of his walks. I say creation because this church is fictive, and it seems to be that he had several reference points for this church, which is called in his book Saint-André-des-Champs, and is in Mes Églises, which is an invented town. It's an invented church. I wonder if I could tell you a little bit about this church, because I investigated. Yes. Okay.
I'm really looking forward to this.
Okay. I have some things to show you too. They're visual aids.
Can I just ask though, what specifically is a portal? I think that not everyone is going to know that.
Indeed. So a portal, as the name might suggest, it surrounds the door. So it's a sculptural surrounding of a door to a building, usually a cathedral or a church. And in this case, we're talking about a church. So this church, Saint-André-des-Champs, is on the Mes Églises way. That's one of two walks that he and his family take from the house in the small village where they go to stay for months at a time. And the Mes Églises way is also Swann's way of titulary fame, I guess we could say. It's really one of my favorite details from this book, which I actually have never told you about, is how he says that the Mes Églises way is always rainy, because it's the shorter of the two walks. Right. So if the weather looks iffy, they go on the shorter walk, which makes total sense. Yeah. But in fact, the fact that the Mes Églises way is always rainy gives occasion for him to describe the portal of this invented church, Saint-André-des-Champs, because they would, and I quote, hurry to take shelter, huddled together cheek by jowl with the stony saints and patriarchs under the porch of Saint-André-des-Champs. How French that church was. Over its door, the saints, the chevalier kings with lilies in their hands, the wedding scenes and funerals were carved as they might have been in the mind of Françoise. Françoise famously is their family's servant and cook. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. One could see that the notions which the medieval artist and the medieval peasant, who had survived to cook for us in the 19th century, had of classical and of early Christian history, notions whose inaccuracy was atoned for by their honest simplicity, were derived not from books, but from a tradition at once ancient and direct, unbroken, oral, distorted, unrecognizable, and alive. So what's remarkable here is the idea that, first of all, that the portal might be the mental image that someone would have of their presumably friends and neighbors, and indeed that the faces and people represented on the portal might be found in the society that surrounds them. He goes on to say that the assistant, the shopkeeper's assistant, Théodore, can be found as one of the figures on the portal. Now, Saint-André-des-Champs has several models, Saint-Martin-des-Champs, but more interestingly, art historically, Saint-Loup-de-Nau. And I want to tell you a little bit about Saint-Loup-de-Nau. First of all, and we'll put a close-up on the screen so you can see this better. But here are some of the figures from the portal. Oh, yeah. So here we have St. Peter, and I'm forgetting who this is. Whoops. Okay, so here we have St. Peter and two other saints. From the portal. And it's just astonishing to look at their faces and think that these people might have been circulating in the community.
I can see it.
I know, I can see it too. But the thing is I can see it, but I never think that way. I wish I would. But I never go around and see a sculpture and I'm like, oh, it's the spitting image of my colleague. I just don't think that way. Do you?
I had that once.
You did? Okay. You don't have to share. We can keep that to yourself. But Saint-Loup-de-Nau is actually a really interesting church. It's near Provins. And it is a very famous portal from the first Gothic phase. Part of the church was built in the late 11th century, but the porch and the portal date from the mid 12th century. I found an article in the Bulletin Monumental from 1933 where Monsieur Francis Salé describes Saint-Loup-de-Nau, and I have translated. A poor and graceless village at the gates of Provins, a dead town folded up around its glorious past, a peaceful corner of French land, hidden in the mystery of a shadowy valley far from the plains of Brie. Why Brie? Okay. Thus Saint-Loup-de-Nau, whose name alone, with its odor of antiquity, evokes incomparable wonders. Apparently, this church was extremely well known at this time because these are incomparable wonders. And indeed, Swann at one point says, people are always pestering me to take them to Saint-Loup-de-Nau. But the only person I would ever take would be Odette, his love, the person that he's sort of beyond obsessed with for quite some time. His obsession finally fades and he marries her. So the only person I would take is Odette, and she has absolutely no interest because indeed she is not interested in things like art and architecture, which are sort of the backbone of Swann's abiding intellectual curiosity.
Yeah, can we say that he's an art historian? I think that's a little bit too professional.
That's a little too professional, but he's working on something about Vermeer, and he apparently is well equipped to take someone to see Saint-Loup-de-Nau. Now, who is Saint-Loup? Sorry, this is like a little bit of just a random deep dive, but I have to show you this, and I need you to see it on camera. So who is Saint-Loup? Saint-Loup is just a bishop of Sens from 576 to 623. He's a saint just because apparently he was quite a good bishop. So they had to come up with some miracles for him to have had because... Sorry, that's a very skeptical way to put it, but he is not a martyr. He didn't perform any great deeds in the name of the church. So in order to prove his sanctity, they had to turn to the miracles he had performed. These miracles include that the cathedral bell rang every time he passed nearby, and whenever there were enemies about, it rang furiously. Another important miracle is that he shut a devil in a pot. And a third miracle, which is depicted on the portal of Saint-Loup-de-Nau, and we'll show a close-up in the center of the portal. This is the very top of Saint-Loup's head. He's in the center of the portal, and above it is his final miracle, which I'll let you take a look at. What Emma is seeing and what you're seeing on the screen is a depiction of a precious stone falling mysteriously from the sky into his chalice. This was apparently his most well-known miracle because it's the only one depicted on the portal of the church that bears his name.
This is amazing.
It is amazing.
It's like a little egg.
It is like an egg. And in fact, it reminds me of the scene from the Bayeux Tapestry where it's an illustration of a fable of the fox and the crow. And the crow... takes a cheese that the fox had wanted, and the fox tricks the crow into releasing the cheese by saying, like, I heard that someone else can sing better than you. And the crow is obviously like, no, I'm the best singer. Opens his mouth wide, the cheese falls. Anyway, there's this lovely moment on the Bayeux Tapestry where the cheese is midair between fox and crow, and it's taken to mean that the cheese is the crown of England, obviously, and the fox and the crow are Harold and William, the two greedy and rapacious people who would like to have said cheese/crown. I digress. Perhaps we should turn back, in fact, to Proust and stop talking about this long ago bishop. But I feel like the idea that Saint-Loup or any of these saints might have been Théodore, that the young narrator, who is called Marcel, not identical with Marcel Proust, the author, that the young narrator is finding these resemblances in art is something that really ties him to Swann, who's in some ways his alter ego in the book. And that sort of interest in locating the place of art in society and creating a sort of a living network between past the past via works of art into the present day. That seems to be a really a central move of the novel so far. So I think it's going to continue, but I don't want to make any big claims.
Yeah, I love the part that you quoted of distorted and alive. I think there's another word in between. Yeah. But I think that really unblocks in some ways some of the thoughts that I've been having in a scattered way about the way that the past is used. Because I think as you were speaking, I was trying to compare the lantern and the church, and wondering if there's some kind of reversal where in the lantern episode it's a kind of a projection of fantasy. There's this reference to the supernatural, whereas this is a kind of naturalistic past fantasy of the church that then appears in the living people all around. But in fact, it's that connection of distortion and alive that links them as well.
Right, the astral body of Golo is not so different from the sort of projection of medieval sculpture into the shopkeeper's assistant. Yeah, in a way,
which comes back to this motif of art and life being not so different, or that Proust is really interested in probing that and asking why art sometimes feels more alive or more real, why life sometimes has a kind of disappointing relation to art,
and how art can have a disappointing relation to life. Actually, that the expectations of art can be so built up that then things turn out differently.
Yeah. Okay. So you just mentioned how Swann and the narrator kind of alter egos to one another, and how this is a moment of merging between them with the church, because the narrator is identifying real people in figures of art. And that, I think, if we're talking about Proust in the pre-modern, we can't skip over the most classic instance of Swann doing that, which is about Odette, who Hannah mentioned as the person who does not give a monkeys about the church or really any of his Swann's artistic interests. Like sometimes she's like, "Oh, you must write your essay. You must get back to your work. It sounds so important."
Well, and apparently Swann's apartment is full of treasures, but she's like, all this old musty stuff. Who would want this? While she lives in just sort of like a nest of chinoiserie that seems sort of gauche.
And then she's totally changed her style again later.
Right. Yes.
So she's a figure of fashion. Yes. Isn't she?
Yes.
Anyway, so it's even funnier in a way that the reason that Swann truly falls for Odette is because he recognises her in a pre-modern painting, or he recognises a pre-modern painting in her, which is from Botticelli's Life of Moses, but it's not, which I will also have on the screen.
And it's Zipporah that is apparently Odette.
Yeah. And it's a section of this much larger painting.
Right.
And Zipporah is kind of, I think it's her posture, that and her attitude that Swann/Proust are really identifying with the character. So she's a classic Botticelli woman, Zipporah, in the painting of, with like flowing blonde hair and very kind of, the face that they all have.
Yes. And that Botticelli face. Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. She is.
Which, when I went to the painting, I was like, what? So this is not how I pictured Odette.
No.
But in fact, that's also part of what we've been talking about, isn't it? That there's something about the sensory experience of the art or the imagination or the projection that is what creates that link. And then also I went back and looked at it, and I saw that it's her eyes.
Yes.
So the figure I'm tempted to try and like copy it. The figure has this kind of, she's kind of tilted and she's looking kind of sad, and so it's that kind of flash of recognition of Odette's kind of
melancholy air,
and her large eyes that actually, so the whole rest of the painting doesn't necessarily have any visual connection with the world that Proust is projecting for us, or that we're imagining through it, but it's actually just the eyes, which in a way, isn't that, well, I don't know if it's only the eyes, but that's something that really came back to me.
It is
which
really...
is kind of creepy. This is gonna be...
Say more. I'm really going to creepy, so tell me.
It's like the eyes of the, you know, that cliche about the eyes of the Mona Lisa are watching you.
Oh, right. Oh, yes. This is sort of like potential for art eyes to mimic real eyes.
Yeah, to have a kind of living eye in the painting. Totally.
I thought you were going for, it's interesting that it's the eyes, because that obviously evokes the gaze, and that we've been talking a lot about projection and about perception. But I like creepy a lot better, so let's stick with that.
I think it's both. And in some ways, maybe it anticipates the way that we eventually get Odette's perspective and we get her looking back at him, but after quite a long time.
Right. So Emma, so far we've been talking about the visual arts, but Proust is also interested in the way that theater and performance arts might project a sort of heightened sense of reality. And this gets really straight to the core of your interest with early modern literature, actually.
Yeah. So we should also say that the narrator is desperate to go to the theatre.
Desperate.
So
truly desperate. But he's too sickly to do so for a long time.
Yeah. Why is he too sick? I guess it's excitement. So he's very sensitive.
He's very sensitive, and when he gets too excited for something, he works himself up into an illness.
Yeah.
So he's supposed to travel to Baalbek or to Venice, and he can do neither because he works himself up into such a lather that he's not able to go either place, which leaves an opening for him to get to know his first great love, who's the daughter of Odette and Swann. We need not go there, but one of the things that his parents are afraid will overstimulate him in a similar way is the theater.
Yeah.
But at last, he persuades them.
Yeah. And so what he's been desiring is to see that this famous actress called La Berma perform, especially as Phèdre, which is kind of the classic pinnacle of the Rossinian canon. I think there's a joke later about how ateliers are the other end of that.
That's a really niche joke.
I found it funny.
But La Berma is sort of a cipher for Sarah Bernhardt.
Yeah.
Sarah Bernhardt is also mentioned by name in the Recherche, but by inventing a sort of fictional double, Proust is able to...
I think she's a composite as well, isn't she? So
yes. Oh, that's right.
Other actresses. But yeah, primarily Sarah Bernhardt. So she's this very prominent diva. Diva, is that the right word?
I think it's fine.
Very prominent actor who the narrator has been dreaming about. So one of the things that seems to happen as well is that he moves from his kind of local dream world of fantasies to meeting real artists, writers, and actually going to the theatre. So that's what's starting to happen in the volume that we're on. But he has to really campaign to go to see Phèdre, because a recent doctor's visit stops him. And I think we should say he really wants to see La Berma, but he also really wants to see Phèdre.
Yes.
So he has a particular relationship with this play that I think tracks through the volumes. So he says, this is near the beginning of volume 2, I implored my parents, who, after the doctor's visit, were no longer inclined to let me go to Phèdre. I recited to myself all day long the speech beginning, they say a prompt departure takes you from us. Trying out every inflection and intonation that could be put into it, the better to appreciate the unexpected way which Bernard would have found of uttering the lines.
I've truly never contemplated doing something similar when I'm going to a play. Have you? I mean, sometimes I'll read the script in advance, but I've never, let me try the intonation so I can know what will be unusual about the actor's interpretation.
No. I mean...
It's very sort of...
Also, it's very funny, this whole thing. The better to appreciate the unexpected. It's like you're expecting every single...
You're attempting to anticipate every intonation that is humanly possible.
Yeah. because he's also been hearing about, he's reading about this in a pamphlet. So there's kind of triangulation between Gilberte, her friend, the writer Bergotte, and the narrator. So he's repeating these lines, and also kind of some words that are really evocative of Racine for him. Christian hair shirt, Jansenist pallor, Delphic symbol, solar myth.
Jansenist pallor.
That's my favourite one. Well, that's also his favourite one, because that comes up again and again. You know, I played on one side of the scales, making Mama unhappy, risking not being able to go to the Champs-Élysées. So that's kind of the dangers of the theatre. And on the other, Jansenist pallor, solar myth.
Oh my gosh.
So
Mama's unhappiness, Jansenist pallor. What will we choose?
So the Jansenists are a 17th century religious movement that educated Racine, and so that have a very kind of fatalistic approach to human existence that ties kind of beautifully with the kind of the teleology of tragedy. So there's quite a lot of work on that, but I love how that gets kind of reduced to Jansenist pallor. Solar myth. I think I might start reciting.
Apparently, you've taken it. You've been influenced by art now.
Pumping myself up to teach Phèdre, which is a absolutely great play. So, but there's this kind of sense of the kind of incantatory power of words, the kind of the relationship between the magic and the supernatural, and also the narrator's inner world almost being displaced,
right, being taken over, almost possessed by these phrases.
So we might see again the relationship between his moi, his self, and the kind of the fantasy of art. But also, there's a kind of comparison to the Lantern episode in some ways, in that he's fixated on Golo. He's just kind of seeing him travel around. It's a really partial and, I mean, from the sound of things, kind of bizarre.
Yes, it is.
Take on this apocryphal medieval tale.
Right.
And in the same way, this kind of, I don't know, parcelled out, vibe-oriented reading of Phèdre. It feels reminiscent of that somehow, that there's this kind of force that comes from it that is related to reading. And to be fair, I'm reading kind of a very select part. I think the narrator thinks a lot about what it's like to read it. I think that's kind of what he's doing when he's thinking about his intonation versus la bermaze.
Right, the translation from the page to the stage, famously.
Yeah, exactly.
So what happens when he finally, because they let him go. I mean, spoiler. They finally let him go. And how does it go for him?
So, shocker. It does not live up to his expectations. Reader, he was disappointed. But in a way that's not stupid, right? That is kind of affecting, because he kind of just doesn't get it. This is his first time in the theatre. He doesn't totally understand what La Berma is doing. He doesn't understand the reaction of the audience. He thinks that in some ways what she's delivering, and he's very invested. So, shall I say briefly the story of Phèdre?
Yes, I think
maybe very briefly.
Yes.
It's centered in some ways around the hero Theseus, but he is absent for more or less the first half of the play. He has left his wife, who he married in the process of after defeating the Minotaur, at home with his son.
Hippolyte.
Poor Hippolyte. While he's been off fighting his kind of heroic battles and becoming even more legendary, his wife has been at home, and she is cursed by Venus, and so
really, who isn't?
Right. Well, actually, this is a digression, sorry, but I think in some ways what I find compelling about all the kind of love stories I've encountered so far in Proust is they're not really cursed. They haven't got this kind of sense of fatal doom.
I guess they don't have
They
doom.
go badly,
Yeah.
but it's kind of fine. No? I mean, this is only volume 2. Anyway, so Phèdre, I'm sorry, I'm telling the story of Phèdre. So his wife has been left at home. She has been cursed. So her curse is that she is taken by an unbearable desire for her stepson, Hippolyte. Mm-hmm. And that goes badly. As it should.
As it must.
Yeah. Anyway, so what the narrator is really obsessed with is her confession. Mm-hmm. She makes this... So there's all these really dramatic... Obviously they're dramatic. All these set-piece confession scenes in Racine. And this is one of them. And it's almost maybe funny because Hippolyte hasn't really understood what she's talking about. Mm-hmm. But she leaps on his kind of apparent opening, say, "Oh, you've already understood me. I've gone too far. Okay, I'm going to tell you everything." And I think that's the right. I
think so.
That's the scene that the narrator is really obsessed with. Anyway, he's really disappointed in it. He finds it doesn't go so well. It's like the other kind of paler women, even more pale, of the Anon and Aricie. She doesn't outshine them. It's just not great, and he's kind of mortified. He has to admit as well when he's asked, because he's been making such a fuss about going to the theatre. So when his father asks, is it Bergot as well asking? Anyway, it's not Poir. Yeah, it's not Poir, of course. They're like, "So how was it, my young friend?" And he's like, "Oh," doesn't know what to say, and he's like, "I was disappointed."
But just as that's his authentic reaction, and I imagine, I guess, all of this had provoked me to try to understand what La Berma's performance was like. Yeah, and it seems to me that it's plausible that it was understated.
Yeah, it sounds like that.
And so, but it's all I've constructed. That's sort of a fantasy of my own, because there's actually very little given in terms of an affective recounting of what he talks about how at one point she raises her hand to eye level while she's bathed in a green light. That doesn't tell me terribly much about what precisely was going on. But
once he's so, again, in a way that I think is quite authentic, he keeps thinking about it after he's been
and reading reviews. I have done this when something has got all the hype in the world. I see it and I'm totally underwhelmed. Who hasn't been there? Yeah. Then I always turn to the reviews and I'm like, surely there's someone out there who was also underwhelmed like I. Alas, often not. However, he too turns to the reviews to see if they can help him make sense of his experience.
Yeah. So yeah, he's kind of reconciling himself to this disappointment over in some ways, and he does say, "Oh, actually, the simplicity was really great." So I think you're right that it must have been an understated performance. So he keeps thinking about his experience of finally watching this great actress perform. So it's kind of the great actress of his moment performing the great role. I think that's put so much pressure on it. Right. So he keeps thinking about what this experience has meant to him. And then his father hands him a newspaper review, which
is glowing.
Is extremely glowing. The occasion of a triumph as brilliant as any that Madame Berma has known in the course of her phenomenal career. Shed an entirely new light on the role of Phèdre, maybe that green light, which is one of the finest and most complex of Racine's creations, and that it constituted the purest and most exalted manifestation of dramatic art which it has been the privilege of our generation to witness. So the narrator's handed this review. He's like, whoa. Which firstly says something about the role of the canon in for Proust and for Marcel. So that's also something that he's negotiating. He's getting to know what the hits of both the kind of classical, neoclassical, and contemporary literature are, and his reaction is mediated by kind of reputation on all those levels. And I think this newspaper instance is one of those. Anyway, how does he react to this review after having lived this experience with Phèdre? As soon as my mind had conceived this new idea, that is, that the performance was the purest and most exalted manifestation of dramatic art, the idea, sped to join the imperfect pleasure which I had felt in the theatre, adding to it a little of what it lacked, and the combination formed something so exalting that I exclaimed to myself, "What a great artist!" So again, it's kind of flat. He goes on to say, maybe you could say that I'm not being completely sincere here, but then he defends that, because there is a certain sincerity, and I think that is really about criticism in a way. Like, obviously this is a very overblown review. At the same time, the reading and the act of kind of experiencing the criticism totally changes his perception of it, and that is what criticism does, and that's not silly.
Right. The criticism can provide a lens that helps someone less knowledgeable reevaluate what it is they're dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, that is it's so hyperbolic, and it actually doesn't give you that much detail, right? You're wondering what exactly was so special about this. This review does not tell you.
No.
So he does a lot with it, right? But nonetheless, I think that the talking about art and the metabolizing of it is massively part of the project.
Well, and that's one of the things I'm just thinking about, how part of the issue is that, like, can a performance really be captured in a novel? Should it be? And I'm thinking now about Vinteuil and the little phrase, which is really a leitmotif of the first volume. It's a phrase from a sonata by a fictional composer called Vinteuil, apparently loosely based on Saint-Saëns, I guess. At any rate, needless to say, this is a fictional sonata. We can't hear the little phrase, and the descriptions of it are evocative, and yet are not, nor could they be, sonically precise, and therefore you're left with some impressions of what the music might generate in an attentive listener, but you're not able ever to access the music, and that feels a little bit about like La Berma's performance.
Although I have a colleague who works on Proust called Jennifer Rushworth, who's now at UCL, and when she was in Oxford, she organised a performance of a sonata by César Franck, who's another model for Vinteuil, and interpreted one of his phrases as something like that phrase. So it was kind of an attempt to do that. This is a digress. I don't know if we should.
No, but
it
can
really,
only ever be an attempt, right? And it can
an
be
approximation,
and it can be a wonderful, it can be a totally worthwhile thing to do. But
amazing.
At the same time, it is sort of categorically an attempt.
Yeah, and I also needed text,
to
experience that.
I
needed a description of the phrase. I needed the booklet. I needed the
Especially as, I think Proust is so knowledgeable about music in a way that few of us are anymore. I don't think it's nearly as current to have the depth of knowledge about classical music that he does. Obviously, needless to say, many do, but I do not. And so it's part of his world is part of what makes his world feel like a different world, like an alien world, are all of these references that we need quite an apparatus to reconstruct. Not to say that they're unreconstructable, but that we rely on works such as the wonderful book Paintings in Proust, or the reconstruction of your colleague to figure out the sort of sonic ambiance. Or we can look up historic reviews of Sarah Bernhardt's performances to get an idea of how this review might crib from them, etc.
Yeah, and we've been doing some of that work today, thinking about these kind of pre-modern moments. And should we finish by talking about how much we could think of them as pre-modern, or kind of, I'm not sure we can get a sense of the overview of it, but in terms of what we've talked about, because I was thinking with Racine that again, to go back to what we were talking about with the lantern, it is so layered. It's so, I guess so, all these words can be overused, mediated. So mediated by contemporaneity, his contemporaneity.
Yes.
Down to them talking about how theatre has totally changed in the last 20 years. The seats are way more comfortable now, which I would have appreciated also.
Yeah.
And the newspaper context, and part of his thrill is the posters that he's seeing everywhere as well. And I think one of the other funny things that I didn't read, but when he's kind of going around telling himself, Jansenist pallor, solar myth, also ladies must take their hats off in the gallery.
Sort of fragments of theatrical discourse almost that he's internalized, and some of which we would think don't really belong to the discourse, but for him it's all part of going to the pillar where the spectacles are posted. So part of me was thinking, okay, this is
early 20th century Racine. In some ways the 17th century Racine doesn't really figure, although that's a bit of an overclaim, and I'm not sure I totally agree with that, because the text is there, he's quoting like, the distance between us. And I think it is part of there being multiple time frames.
Right.
Especially, and it also depends who you are reading it. Because I'm thinking, okay, how does this compare to a 17th century performance? Not that I witnessed those either, but I know a little bit more about it. I think something that felt quite jarring for me was that he's only watching the first 2 acts of Phèdre, so he's not seeing the denouement,
right?
Which I can't really imagine.
No, that's completely bizarre for such a teleological play to take away the telos. Completely odd.
But it kind of works quite nicely though with again my overclaim about how there isn't the tragic really in Proust. There's some of the affect, some of the kind of confession, secrecy, plot complication that you get in the first 2 acts of a classical tragedy, but then not the real crisis. And
I feel like it's too soon.
Yeah, it's too soon.
We're still in the first act in terms of the architecture of the whole. Gosh, to mix metaphors, how horrible. Well, I guess we did talk about both plays and architecture, so perhaps our viewers will forgive me.
I think that would be too neat anyway.
But we do hope you'll join us. Perhaps you too will consider reading Proust.
Yes,
and
definitely.
if not, maybe you'll still listen to our podcast, Proust Curious, which again comes out this fall wherever you get your podcasts.
So you have 6 months.
Get started now. It was so nice talking to you today, Emma.
Thanks so much for having me, Hannah.
Thanks for coming all the way from England. What a thrill.
It's been a treat.